Well, good evening, everybody. This is the second part of Rosemary's interview. I don't know whether it's because I was a bad interviewer or whether she's just lived so long that she had double the amount to say. So we are continuing, I think, from the time when you started in ministry. Is that right, Rosemary?
Well, actually, there was a hiccup between. It's really when Paul died, wasn't it? We got up to Paul.
Yes.
So I was suddenly alone, the children all at university and so forth. And so I had to sort of, I got a job. I don't think this is so much known about. I was appointed as a divisional secretary at what was then the Mission House. It's now Church House in London. And so I sold up our lovely shabby country home where we'd been in practice and bought a small house in Norwich. There was something to come back to, and moved to London into a Methodist house. Actually, it was the house that Colin Morris lived in Fulham, and started working at the Mission House as the Home Education Secretary, which was a divisional appointment. My main responsibility was for a programme that was on at the time called The World Church in Britain. Looking back on it, I think the idea was a bit naive, actually, but it meant well. The idea was we brought in people from the overseas churches to come and sort of really share their experience and their theology with the British Church. My job was to look after them. We had 2 or 3 who were very good indeed, but if you think about it, we're offering to bring people in from overseas countries, third world countries, at our expense. And I'm afraid what happened was we had several people who were quite important in their own eyes, nobody else's, who really saw it as a free holiday. And I had to look after them and find them somewhere, people to have them and so forth. We had some rather disastrous cases. We had one man, I won't say who he was or where he came from, but he'd been a sort of tribal leader in his own place and was used to being looked after. And rather foolishly, he was stationed, well, he was with a lady Methodist minister who lived alone. And she had a busy job to do. And he didn't like, she discovered, didn't like getting up much before 10 or 11 in the morning when she was trying to have a busy day's work. And then he'd come down, sit at the table and clap his hands expecting service. Not quite what we'd expected.
No.
And we had some ministers who were stationed. We had one family, and when we invited them, they had 4 children. And when they arrived and I met them at the airport, they got 6 children. They've been busy in the interval. So of course that made a huge difference to their stipend, because it meant that you in the stipends you get paid as you get children, not for what you do. And it was difficult in many ways. And also we realized that very quickly that what he'd actually come for was to get a free education for his children, because where he lived there wasn't free education. So I mean, in a way, who can blame them? They were offered this golden ticket, and we had some outstandingly good ones, I have to say, who were wonderful, but not very many. A lot of them really saw it as a holiday, and they weren't going to sit in stuffy conferences. They were jolly well going to see the sights and enjoy England. And I had
so
to take
what year was this?
This was way back in the 80s.
Oh, in the 80s. Right.
Yes. And I had to introduce them all. I had to go to conference every year, of course. And my job was to look after. There were usually about 30 overseas visitors, and not all of them on the World Church in Britain programme, but some of them were. And my job was to introduce them all to the president at the conference. So I had a lot of responsibility, particularly as I kept losing them. They kept disappearing because, we were in Plymouth and they wanted to go and see Plymouth. And I remember I lost one African gentleman for quite a time. He was easy to find because he always wore 2 hats. And so I'd go hastily into Plymouth sort of High Street and say, have you seen a large African gentleman with 2 hats on? And they said, oh, yes, we've just seen one going into Marks and Spencer's or something. So I go chasing around, trying to round up all my World Church in Britain people. It was a fairly hectic job. It had its adventures, and it was quite amazing. But it was while I was there that political correctness was beginning to come in a big way. And the word missionary had become a dirty word. You didn't use it because it was connected with colonialism and British superiority and all the rest of it. So we weren't allowed to call ourselves or call anybody. I mean, I was a returned missionary, but we weren't allowed to use the word. And it was really political correctness gone mad. We had to be so careful what we said. And of course, it's not really got any better, has it? We still have plenty of it. And I remember getting so frustrated in one committee meeting where I said, I'm not a person, I'm a per daughter. I got so cross with everybody. It was all about political correctness. And in the end, I thought, well, I can't go on here much longer. I stayed several years, and then I felt really this call to the ministry. I candidated for the ministry and I got straight in. And because I'd done missionary training and so forth, the idea was that I would train on the hoof. And someone was appointed to be my tutor. I have to say, in all honesty, it didn't work out very well. However, I had to just get on with it. And I went straight into an appointment at Great Yarmouth Circuit, and where I had some village chapels and Caister, not Great Yarmouth itself, but Caister on Sea. And I got settled quite quickly into village life and circuit life. That's where I met I'm a bit worried about meeting vicars, because a lot of vicars don't approve of Methodist ministers, especially women ones. But the one there was a lovely man. And I remember him coming at the meeting, had a welcome thing for me, and he came sort of rushing down the hall, both arms outstretched, and said, at last we're complete. Wasn't that nice? Lovely man. And we worked very happily together because we had a huge number of chapels between us, churches and chapels. And he used to say, right, I'll do this end of our, particular our area. And he said, you do the other end. So I got dead good at taking evensong by candlelight and so on. We had lots of adventures. He was a lovely man. But then there was an awful shortage, as there is today, of Methodist ministers. And we were reckoned to be overstaffed. And so after 3 years, I was told that I was the last in, therefore the first out. And we were having to lose a minister, and I was the one to be lost. And so I went to Birmingham. I've been happy in Great Yarmouth. I had a youth group, an active youth group. We'd done lots of nice things, and it was lovely. So I went to Birmingham, to Rookery Road, which is in Handsworth. And again, that they did not want a woman minister. They'd never had one, and they made it very plain when I got there that I was not at all welcome, which made it a bit difficult. But they soon relented, and again, I had a lovely youth group. The church was half black, half white. The black part being partly West Indian, partly African, mainly West Indian, but also Africans. And there's a very big difference between the psychology of Africans and West Indians. The West Indians were much more sort of shy and timid to take part in things. The Africans were much more confident. But the ecumenical situation there was very good indeed. It was absolutely lovely. Vicar was appointed soon after I got there, David. There was a URC minister called David as well. And in fact, there were two URC ministers, a vicar and a curate, and a Roman Catholic priest. And we really did mix incredibly well. We had regular staff meetings in each other's houses. We always had a standard lunch. It was always soup and a sandwich, so that nobody got pretentious and tried to have more elaborate menus. So we all did soup and a sandwich. And those men, I was the only woman, of course, those men were absolutely delightful. And I loved all of them. We got on so well, and we worked so very, very well together. We were very fortunate. It was at the time, if you remember, of the Beef Mountain. Do you remember all those mountains we had? And as the Methodist Church, Rookery Road, had by far and away the best kitchen and the best facilities, all these mountains happened at our church, although they were all, of course, staffed by Roman Catholics. And I remember the Roman Catholic priest, when it was their turn to do the lunch, and we used to have between 80 and 100 people for every lunch. They were splendid. And I remember the Roman Catholic priest, dear Jerry, coming when it was over. All his staff had worked so hard, and he came into Methodist premises, can you believe, carrying a big basket full of bottles of wine. I didn't tell the superintendent. I just let it happen because he wanted to reward his hardworking staff. Yeah. So I didn't mention that it wasn't allowed on Methodist premises, but it was very funny. And we also had the most wonderful Christmas parties. They were just delightful. There were a lot of elderly people living in little 2-up, 2-down terraces all around the Methodist church. And again, this was ecumenical. And we used to give this beautiful party, Christmas party, every year I was there. And David, the vicar, who had quite a substantial frontage, so he was always Father Christmas. And he said he'd only be Father Christmas if I would be his elf. So I had to be the elf, and he was Father Christmas. And we gave these, I've never laughed so much. You laughed till your tummies ached. It was wonderful. We had a superb lunch provided by the churches. Each of the ministers provided a turkey, and the URC did the carrots, the Anglicans did the sprouts, the Methodists did the mince pies and all the trimmings, and I can't remember what the Roman Catholics did. They did something. We all did something. Yeah. And then we invited, and lots of people who were really poor. There were a lot of poor people. Mm-hmm. And again, we seated regularly 80 to 100 people each year. And one Christmas, I remember a policeman came in just as we were starting. And he came up to me very shyly and said, this family, a woman with 4 children who he brought in with him, he said their father died last night in a drunken brawl in the pub. Will you please have them for your Christmas party? After that, they came every year. And they became very much part of the family. They were lovely. And I really enjoyed Birmingham. It was a wonderful place to be.
So did they accept you after a while?
Oh, yes, completely.
Good.
I had a great youth club, and they were wonderful. They were mainly in their teens, and we used to sit, we had a meeting, well, because I was preaching there virtually every week, and we used to have a meeting during the week. What are we going to do on Sunday? Because they wanted to do drama. And so we used to write our own drama. And we did some really, when I look back, they were really good. And we had an awful lot of fun. And we did these lovely dramas. And I remember one week we'd had Jesus calling the disciples. And when it got to the end, Jesus was played by a lovely West Indian boy, Clifford. Lovely, lovely boy. And he led his disciples, and we got a whole lot of visitors that week. And it was a big church, and he led his disciples round. That was going to be the end of the sketch, the drama which we'd done with the calling the first disciples. And as he went, they began to sing, "Follow, follow, I will follow Jesus," which is a chorus. And to Clifford's dismay, the congregation all got up and began to follow. And it was a big congregation, and they marched all around the church, and Clifford at the front. And when he got to the front, he came to me and looked at me desperately and said, "What do we do now?" So I said, "Look, turn round and say, let's say the Lord's Prayer together," which he did. And they all did it very reverently. And then he said, "Please go back to your seats." We had some hilarious moments, mainly with the young people and this large and very loving congregation. It was huge fun. I really enjoyed it. And any question about being a woman didn't matter. In fact, when I left, they asked for another woman. So it didn't exactly hurt. No. And they had a very good lady who followed. She was lovely. What I failed to mention, actually at our last interview, was that in the 70s, I'd actually started working for Radio 4 and the World Service regularly. writing scripts and things, and I was doing God slots, and the Welsh service was more interesting because that was a half an hour to do what I liked with, which was lovely. I also started working for BBC Two television and ITV, doing services and various religious programs and so on, which was absolutely fascinating. But when I'd finished at Birmingham, it was then time to come home, and I came back to Norwich, the idea being that I was going to retire. But what actually happened was that they'd opened a new ecumenical church at Thorpe Marriott. At least they hadn't opened it. The Methodist church at Thorpe Marriott was meeting in the village hall, but they were building this church, which was going to be ecumenical. And I don't know if you've ever seen Thorpe Marriott Church, but it's beautiful. It's a lovely modern church. And one of my friends, Al Loads, do you remember Al Loads, any of you? He was in the Norwich circuit, because I moved back. I was going to live in my little house in Norwich and go to Chapelfield Road. Of course, it didn't happen, because what happened was that I was asked, would I possibly consider being part-time? I mean, can you believe being part-time at a new church? You know, so I accepted part-time, but actually, of course, it was full-time. And we started at the village hall and watched the building going up. And it was truly lovely. It's a charming little building, and still is to this day. I'm going there shortly. I've got an appointment coming up. And I became the first minister. And I remember being told very ominously, but of course, if there's a woman minister, you know, it's all right if the church is established, but if it's a new church, you do realise that nobody will come, and certainly there will be no men. But I remember when we opened our first lovely opening, and I was rather gratified to find that there were actually more men than women. And we that was a lovely church, a lovely experience. We had so much going on there, and that's where we started the soup run with the Salvation Army. And I appealed at one of the first services I went to. I said, we need a team. Every team has to have 2 men and 1 woman. And I think we finished up with, 2 teams. And you work with the Salvation Army in Norwich. Has anyone done the soup run, I wonder? It's very interesting, because you go around the squats, you go around the doorways where vagrants, you know, homeless people are sleeping. And you make soup. We always did homemade soup in flasks, and you make a batch of sandwiches, which you provide, of course, and then you go around. So you always go with 2 men. I had 2 strong men and me, and the other teams were 2 men and a woman. It always has to be 2 men in case there's violence. And then you go around the squats, and you sit in the most incredible places and doorways and things, and hand out sandwiches and soup, talk to people and find out where they're coming from. Some of them are in churchyards. I think the Salvation Army have a centre now where they have a stall rather than going round. But when I was doing it, we went round in the middle of the night to all these people, and you find some unbelievably sad, lonely, frightened people, and quite a lot of them ex-prisoners, got nowhere to go, nowhere to live. It was an extraordinary ministry, which I got very involved in. And so Thorpe Marriott was wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. Starting a new church from scratch was very exciting. And we had people who hadn't been Methodists, we had non-Methodists joining. And of course, it was ecumenical. So I never did discover how they worked out the assessment, because the Methodist was supposed to pay something, but also because we had Anglicans. And the vicar there, when I arrived at Thorpe Marriott, dear man, he greeted me, bless his little heart, and he said, my conscience demands that I tell you that I cannot accept women or Methodists, which was me done for, wasn't it? We then proceeded to work perfectly happily together, although we did have some, I suppose, some altercations, because he certainly disapproved of us very strongly. But of course, there were Anglicans who were coming to Thorpe Marriott and not going to St Edmunds. So it made it a bit difficult for him. And we also had united services with Drayton and Taverham. And I remember one service we had when we had the United service at Thorpe Marriott. Of course, the church was packed and it was a communion service. And so he stood on one side with the bread and the wine. And I stood on the other. And to his, I think, colossal annoyance, the Anglicans all came to me. I think they wanted to make a point. So we had our funny moments. But I remember when we had the bishop came, it was a confirmation service, joint confirmation, Methodist, Anglican. And that was held at St. Margaret's at Drayton's, because we all turned up. And we had some candidates for confirmation, and it was very lovely. And John and I, that's the vicar and me, the vicar who disapproved of me, we were given the lady chapel because it was spread out. The bishop was going to take the central communion, and then there were side chapels, the lady chapel we were in, and the other one was on the other side. So John and I went towards our altar where we were going to distribute communion. And I know that for the Anglicans, the most important part, of course, is giving out the bread, the wafers. And John looked at me and I looked at John. And I picked up the wafers and I said, I will be gracious, John, you could distribute the wafers, I will follow you with the wine. He gave me a beatific smile. We did actually, we did get on very well. I mean, he melted a lot as time went on. And it was interesting, though, very interesting. But again, we did a lot of drama. There were people there who were quite interested in drama, which of course was always my thing, because I'd been a drama student at one stage in my long career. So I loved it. Thorpe Marriott was great. And in the meantime, of course, I was still broadcasting for Radio 4. And then because I'd come back to Norfolk, I was asked if I would start taking over the Pause for Thoughts on Radio Norfolk. So I moved also into Radio Norfolk and organised, as you know, Pippa, because you used to come. And so did David Yarham. And I used to invite my Methodist friends to do Pauses for Thought. Was it called Pauses for Thought? It was, wasn't it?
Yes.
Pauses for Thought. And I was responsible for all the Pauses for Thought. And it was lovely because I got all sorts of people. I remember, because I thought I got to be multi-faith, so I invited by this time I was working at the prison, and I invited the Muslim chaplain to come and do some Pauses for Thought. And so I asked him to send me the scripts, which he didn't, but I turned up and he didn't turn up, but sent a substitute with no scripts. And there I was with the studio booked. So what we decided to do on the spur of the moment was discuss the pillars of Islam.
Wisdom.
Yes, the pillars of wisdom. So we did that, and it actually, amazingly enough, worked out rather well. It filled the spaces, but I did feel a bit let down. So I was working then still at Thorpe Marriott, and when I started, what had happened was I was in the Norwich circuit, and what happened was that the man who was the prison chaplain, the Methodist prison chaplain, well, actually it was the Free Church prison chaplain, which was normally a Methodist, and he was moving back to the north, and the man who was following him made it very clear there was no way he was going to go into the prison. Actually, when I met him, I could see the point, really. He wouldn't have really stood a chance. He was just not right. And our wonderful superintendent minister looked at me very firmly, and I was sort of looking at my diary, all the empty spaces, thinking all the things I was going to do come September when I retired. And everyone was looking at me, and he said, you could do it. I said, I'm terrified of rough men. I couldn't possibly do it. I am terrified of rough men. And I remember him saying, well, look, try it for 3 weeks. And if you can't hack it, we'll find someone else. So to my horror, I discovered myself in Norwich prison, absolutely scared out of my life, with a man who was retiring. And I remember we were in the chapel, and that leads straight on to what was then A Wing. It's all changed now. They built new buildings. And he opened the door to go onto the wing. And I said, "We're not going in there, are we?" He said, "Of course, that's where the work is." And I remember we went through this door to this terrifying wing with all these prisoners milling around, these great big men. And I was absolutely scared stiff. And then, of course, 3 weeks later, I knew it was the right place. I'd gone to the right place. And of course, I stayed for 15 years. And
right.
it was,
so that was while you were at Thorpe Marriott?
yeah, it started then, yes. And then and I retired from Thorpe Marriott. And the prison then became hugely important. And I was doing a lot of preaching still. I was working really mainly in the Norwich circuit and all around. So I was preaching most Sundays. And of course, I was broadcasting a lot, and particularly World Service, which I particularly enjoyed. And I was also doing services on ITV and I said at BBC too. So I kept pretty busy. And then, of course, I came to Holt to retire.
So what happened? I thought you were at Acle for a time.
Well, that was long ago. That was when Paul was alive.
Oh, right.
No,
sorry.
That was when Paul was alive. That was we were in the Acle circuit.
Right.
I came to Holt with a view to retire, only to discover again, I'm very retiring, only to discover that they needed a minister in Holt. And what actually happened was that I saw this advertisement in the Methodist Recorder every week, supernumerary needed in part-time in the, it was then a smaller circuit then, it was the, what was it
Wells and Holt.
Fakenham and Wells Holt circuit.
But you did come to Fakenham for a while, didn't you?
That was an emergency. That was an emergency for a year because Roy Coppack got moved to Acle.
That's right.
And they were desperate. So I went to Fakenham for a year. And so then came into this circuit. And then this advert kept coming in the Methodist Recorder, wanted a supernumerary. And I rang up Frida because I knew Frida. Do you remember Frida? She was the treasurer of Wells. And she was the circuit treasurer, wasn't she?
Yes, yes.
She lovely lady. And I rang up Frida and I said, "I've seen this notice keeping on coming up in the Methodist Recorder for a supernumerary." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Have you had any bites?" And she said, "Absolutely nothing. We're desperate." So I thought, well, I said, "What do you think if I came?" She said, "Come immediately." So that's really how I came. I said, "Suppose they don't like me. They might not want a woman minister." And anyway, I came and apparently it was all right. And of course, I moved into the manse. And so I bought, actually, when I was in the manse, I bought where I am now in this bungalow and let it out. So that was quite useful. But of course, I lived in that great big manse. It really was a bit big for a woman on her own with 2 pussycats. And that's when I had Zibby. Do you remember Zibby?
Yes.
Yes, he came one morning to morning prayers on the Friday morning, and the poor chap was working. It was when Poland was going through a terrible time. There was no work, and Zibby was a double graduate, and there were adverts. Mainly, I think this Indian firm that employed people to work unqualified as assistants in care homes. And Zibby got a job at Pine Heath, which was a care home then, run by this Indian. And he housed his staff, who were mainly overseas. Some of them were very poor English, which isn't good in a care home for the elderly. And he housed them in these rundown caravans that he got very cheap at these, lots going in sales. And Zibby's caravan was absolutely awful. It had nothing. And he came to the Methodist church. He was, unusually for a Polish man, he was a Protestant. He came, he said, "Is there anyone here who has a spare bedroom that I could use as a sort of bed sit for the that I'm here?" So you must admit I'm a terrible risk taker. I said, "I've got 3 empty bedrooms. Come along and have a look and see which one you like." He moved in that day. and stayed for a year. And he was an absolute sweetheart. We just got on so well together. He was a dear, sweet, kind man. We didn't agree on diet because Polish people tend to eat an enormous amount of dried stuff, whereas I tend to live on salads and fruit. They never have fresh fruit. They never have fresh vegetables. So he did his own menu and I did mine. But we lived very, very happily together and he was such a support. It was just lovely having him. In fact, when he left at the end of a year, we were both in tears. I just didn't want him to go. He was just such a lovely companion. And of course, I'd been to Poland because when he got married, he married the beautiful Banatka. And he said, you've got to come and stay with us because we've always kept in touch. We still do. And I went to Poland to stay with them. And the moment I got there, he said, you do realize that I'm going to take you to Auschwitz. Everyone should go to Auschwitz. And we went. And of course, it was, well, if you've been, it's just unbelievable. And it's something you just will never, ever forget. It's actually imprinted on my mind forever. So I started a happy career in Holt, which I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed. And we even did some drama. If you remember Tony,
yes.
Those in Holt.
An angel.
The angel Gabriel with if you remember, a halo that lit up. Do you remember that? It was amazing. He made his own props. And we did some drama, didn't we, in those days?
Yes.
Because I just love doing drama. And if I don't write it myself, we get somebody else's. And I can't remember all the things we did. You must remember some of them, Pippa, because you were playing the organ.
Yeah. I can't remember all of them.
Yeah, it's all a long time ago now.
Yes. So how many times have you actually retired?
I've lost count. I said I'm very retiring.
Yes. And then at the age of over 80, did you not start Stepping Stones?
Yes. And that went on for 4 years. Unfortunately, we've had to really abandon it now. But and that was lovely, wasn't it, Pippa?
Yes, it was. Yes. Yeah. We
It
had
was
some
great
lovely
fun.
people.
We had some lovely people. I'm sure there were things I was going to tell you about because we've got a little bit more time. Was there anything you wanted to?
Well, the other thing, radio you've talked about, prisons you've talked about. Any regrets?
Prison. Not really. I think the prison we haven't really said much about. The prison was an extraordinary experience because I know there are people who think that the way I did it, it was really the way Judith. I mean, we had a terrible chaplain at first. Fortunately, he left, and then we had the wonderful Judith as the Anglican chaplain, and she was superb, and we worked incredibly happily together. And she had, very similar ideas to mine. But what, of course, I discovered was that all these rough men I was so frightened of actually, of course, are incredibly in need and desperately, desperately lonely and frightened. And I discovered that, if I tell you one example, there was a lot of the officers are ex-military, and there was one chap, I think he'd been a sergeant major, and I remember him looking at me very fiercely and said, I don't think you should be here. This is no place for a woman. You're absolutely wrong here. Well, I sort of thought, I had nothing to say, so I sort of trotted off. But then I noticed he kept on sending for me in difficult situations when they got a violent prison or someone who was shooting his mouth, and it was all getting difficult. And I found I was being posted into a cell. I mean, there was always a 6-foot officer standing outside, it was all right. But I was posted into a prisoner who was unmanageable. And I'd sort of slip in beside him and hold his hand. And I discovered that I could get to places where 6-foot men couldn't get. You see, I was vulnerable, totally vulnerable. I had no nothing except me. And I would just slip in, and I'm small, as you know, I've got nothing about me. And of course, you see what happens then. If you get, I mean, you can get violent men who are violent towards vulnerable women, but for an awful lot of men who are feeling violent and desperately unhappy, to see, and I wasn't a dolly bird, I was already getting on, and to have someone come in like that who's non-threatening, they don't feel they've got to put on a show.
Mhm.
And 9 times out of 10, they'd finish up in tears telling me all about it. And I'd sit and hold their hands. And that's why they used me. And it happened again and again and again. And I was always finding myself in that position of going and sitting beside someone who was just not coping and was feeling incredibly threatened. And I say I could get to places where a big man couldn't get. You see, they'd feel challenged by a big man. I was no challenge at all. I was just a pushover. And maybe what they were seeing also was a mum.
Yeah.
I may not be a very motherly looking figure, but I am a mum. And so I could get to these difficult places. I remember we had an African. He was Church of England. I got to know him soon after he arrived in the prison, and he was very charming. He was Oxford educated. He was a very important businessman. And he'd come over from Ghana. And I think the trouble was he was a chief, or the son of a chief. And well, I know Africa, I've lived there. And they, on the whole, tend to regard themselves as being rather above the general run of things. They don't have to obey the same rules as everyone else. And apparently he'd done something silly at customs. I don't know what he'd done. It was nothing very serious. But whatever it was, he'd been arrested. And so to his huge annoyance, he found himself in prison. So, of course, as soon as he got to prison, he demanded that he ring his mother in Ghana. And, of course, you do not ring Ghana from the prison. You have a phone allowance, but it doesn't include Ghana. So the result was he'd been in a privileged cell. It was in the days before they didn't all have television. He'd been put in a privileged cell, in a privileged, with television and a radio, a cellmate, because they had to share. There were so many prisoners. And he just threw a wobbly. He got the television, broke it up, got the sink off the wall, the wash basin off the wall, broke that up, and was standing there armed with a piece of porcelain with a big sharp point at the end of it, and a piece of glass from the television, threatening to kill anyone who came in. And that was when they sent for me, as they do.
Yeah, right.
Yes. So I was posted to this cell. And I'm not kidding, there were 10 fully armed officers on one side with shields. And there were another 10 officers or so on the other side watching. And he couldn't see them from where he was in his cell. And there was me. I mean, it has to be funny. This is where my son falls off his chair laughing. And so I said, what on earth's all this about? I can't remember. We talked for half an hour and they all stood and waited. And I said, this isn't you, come on, you know. And I don't remember what we talked about. Anyway, we talked about all sorts of things. And I said, look, you're a Christian, you're a member of the Church of England. And, you know, anyway, we chatted on. And then he suddenly said, I feel terribly tired. I said, well, I'm not surprised. You've, you know, put rather a lot of energy into this. And he said, what do I do? I said, well, you let them come in and they will take you. He said, they'll kill me. I said, no, not in England. That's not what we do here. I said, they'll probably take you to the stake, but I said, if you come quietly and do nothing, everything will be all right. So he said, what shall I do? I said, well, first of all, put your weapons down, which he did. And I said, then stand with your hands behind you and the officers will come in and they will not hurt you. Don't forget, all the officers were hearing every word I said. And that, of course, was exactly what happened. The senior officer came in and they took him quietly away. I did visit him later on, and I thought he might be cross with me, but he wasn't. He was just very grateful. And of course, he was only in for a few days and he went out. But that's the sort of thing that can happen. And that's where being a woman can be incredibly useful. I remember another occasion, which was terribly funny. We did have funny occasions, we really did. When I'd been sent for by this young, I think he was West Indian actually, And we sorted out whatever it was. I'd gone into his cell and we'd sat and talked about it and got it sorted. And I got up to go, and without any warning whatsoever, he flung his arms around me and gave me a great big kiss. It was terribly funny. And then he jumped away. He said, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that." And I said, "No, you should not." He said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Your secret's safe with me, but don't ever do it again." And of course, had I reported him, he'd have been arrested, he'd been taken to the SEG. But I remember I saw him later on with a group of prisoners a few days later, and it was terribly funny. He looked at me and went, little wave, and I went, we did have some funny moments. Another very funny moment, which I remember, I treasure, was I'd been left alone with far too many prisoners, about 15 or 20 of them. And the one or two of them were very unstable. Don't forget, a lot of prisoners are mentally ill. And it was a very unstable situation. I should not have been alone. An officer had failed to turn up. And I really don't know how it had happened. And I have to say, a little bit anxious. I didn't mean to show it, but perhaps I did. But I became aware of a very large presence standing behind me. And the voice in my ear whispered, "Don't worry, love, I'll look after you." It was a great big Yorkshire prisoner. And of course he would have done.
Yes.
He would have cared, he would have protected me. And I mean, I got so much to sort of understand and learn what they're really like. And yes, there were some who were horrible, some of the nastiest people I've ever met. But most of them were people who had a rotten background, never really had a chance in life. An awful lot of them were from broken homes. They'd been hurt by life, seriously damaged by life. An awful lot of the sex offenders are actually people who were grossly abused in childhood. Prison is not really the right place for an awful lot of people. And of course, the more you understand that, the closer you can get to people, and then you can start being a real help. I know one of the thoughts for the day I've done on this is the difference between being for people or being with people. And you see, I'm disapproved of, I have to say, by some people who work in the prison. Not have to say, by the officers. They thought I was okay. But they say you don't get friendly with prisoners. They call you Mrs. Wakelin. They don't call you Rosie, which most of them call me. They don't treat you familiarly. You don't sit beside them and hold their hands. You stand at the door and you address them. And because I never did, I was always hands-on. And it's about being with, where you go down where they are, which, as far as I'm concerned, is what the gospel's about.
Yes.
Because when I look at Jesus, he didn't lecture them from a position of superiority and judgment. He got down beside them. That's why they killed him. He was far too threatening. And I think I saw that as what chaplaincy was about, was getting down beside them, being with them. And that's what I tried to do. Judith did it too. She was excellent. And of course, the result was a lot of prisoners came to love me quite a lot. And I've kept up with 6, which is disapproved of by some people, but not by the prison. And I've got one prisoner who I still visit. I should be seeing him in a week or two. He always says that I saved him from suicide. I went in to do his reception. He wouldn't even look at me. He was just looking at the floor and he was in tears. And I remember I just went and quietly sat beside him and took his hand. We said nothing. I went to see him later on, but I do remember him saying to me, "I thought no one else would ever touch me in all my life, and you held my hand." Well, that's one that I've become very friendly with. And the prison asked me, because his family have totally dropped him, he's got no one in the world. They asked me if I'd be his next of kin. So I'm now his aunt. We sat down and thought about it, and he said, well, perhaps aunt would be the best relationship. So I'm now his auntie. And he signs his letters, he writes regularly. He said, your favourite nephew. And he writes me, his spiritual journey is long and hard. He's a lapsed Roman Catholic, and we've got him back on track. He's back praying now. and he's back going to mass, but he feels he's not worthy to take communion, but he does attend. So we're getting him back on track.
So you've been an influence on quite a lot of people.
Well, I don't know. All I've done is try to be there for them, be there with them.
Yeah, you've supported them, but other people that you've met over your years,
yes,
you must have influenced them in some way to go on and do things that perhaps they wouldn't have done had they not met you.
I like to hope so. Certainly some of the ones I've kept up with have never reoffended, which is quite important.
Who would you say has been the greatest influence on you?
Jesus Christ.
Yes. Well, that was
bluntly.
I know the answer's Jesus, but it looks like a dog. Yeah. Who else would you say?
I think people who've taken risks. The first minister that I really listened to, because we became Methodist when we moved to the north when I was 4, and we went to this absolutely amazing Methodist church. It was a new church, and I remember the first minister as being a lovely man. When I was 9, we had a new minister. Now, we were 3 times a Sunday cheap people. You know, we went morning junior church, afternoon Sunday school, evening, no children, of course, so no concessions. And my mother always took paper and pencil so we could draw pictures during the sermon. And I suddenly realized when our new minister arrived that I wasn't drawing pictures, I was listening. He was absolutely amazing. I was gripped, totally gripped. He absolutely adored Charles Wesley's hymns, and we always had them. I remember him saying they are theology. If you read Charles Wesley's hymns, you're reading theology. So if for any reason he wasn't preaching, which wasn't often, and it was a boring preacher, I started reading Charles Wesley's hymns without realizing that I'd started studying theology. And I still love Charles Wesley's hymns, and I still study them. And they are theology. And he was my minister when I was ordained.
Oh, right.
Yes, I asked him, I'd always kept up with him. And I remember him saying, "You don't want me, you know everybody. You worked at the mission house. You've been a divisional secretary. You can have who you like." I said, "Yes, I like you." So he was my minister. And the other one, that Colin Morris, was a terrific influence on me. He was so brave. I mean, he was, when we were in Sierra Leone, he was posted to Chingola, which was the copper belt in Zambia. And I know some people know this story, but it's an extraordinary story. And of course, the copper belt required miners and engineers who were all white. And he was sent to this ecumenical church in Chingola, which was built really as a white church. And Colin had gone as a missionary. And he hadn't been there very long before they realized the church just wasn't big enough, because it was packed, standing room only every Sunday. So they extended it, they made a bigger church. And again, it was packed full. Colin, if you've ever heard him, was a marvelous preacher. I mean, you're just gripped. You just listen to him, you have to. And then it came to Lent, and he announced that he was going to preach to his white congregation. This was in the 50s, and apartheid was ruling supreme in South Africa. And of course, don't forget, Zambia was then Northern Rhodesia. So Northern Rhodesia, Southern Africa, apartheid was reigning supreme. It was terrible. And Colin, it's only Colin who could have done this. He preached a series of sermons based on a text which unfortunately I've forgotten, and he's gone and died, and I can't ask him, on God's inclusion of the whole human race as one family. No, apartheid, racism is wrong. Well, as he was preaching his first sermon in a packed church, people began to get up and walk out and slam the door. In 3 weeks, he'd emptied the church. No kidding. There was no one left. And the church had a debt on it because of the new building. And all he had left was 6 people. 2 of them I still keep up with, a doctor and his wife. who I meet when we go to the Methodist School of Fellowship. And this little group of people, they were the stewards of the church, and he called them together and he said, I can only apologize. I have emptied your church. I shall go back to London and ask them to send you a minister who will rebuild. And they said to him, please go out of the room. So the poor Colin went out of the room and paced about for an hour. And then they called him in. And they said, and I think this has to be extraordinary, they said, we refuse to accept your resignation because you were right and this church is wrong. And we want you to stay with us, and we will start again, and we will rebuild the church. My mind went back instantly to that wonderful minister who came when I was 9, because I remember in one of his sermons, I remember quite a lot of his sermons, believe it or not, and I remember once he said, a preacher can empty his church, but he can fill it again. Oh, empty his church by preaching the gospel, but he will fill it again. Now that's my inspiration, if you like. And that's what Colin did. And these 6 people remained loyal. They threw open the doors. They sang lustily Charles Wesley's hymns every Sunday. And they put a great big poster outside the church. I've got a photograph. I think I've still got it somewhere. It was in the Methodist Recorder. A great big poster was stuck outside the church, which read, "This church is colorblind." And slowly, people who, he'd had death threats and resignations by every post. And of course, they had a debt on the church. And those 6 people agreed to underwrite the debt, bless their hearts. And people began to slowly, who'd never been before, to come. Black people started to come. And that church was born again.
Well, Rosemary, I think there may well be several people who would like to ask you questions, and they've got to ask them quickly, and you've got to answer quickly.
Answer quickly, very quickly.
Is there anyone who would like to ask Rosemary a question? I can't see. Yes, Ailsa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's not actually a question. It refers to part 1, when Rosemary said that she travelled to Sierra Leone on Elder Dempster lines.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I also travelled on Elder Dempster lines. I was on the Pippa, the Accra and the Oriole. But unlike you, I did make it to Nigeria. In the 50s, I spent quite a bit of my childhood because my father was out there working. And it
Isn't
just
it interesting?
Yeah, and it just brought back some memories of good
Well, I
times.
remember the Oriole very well.
That was the latest one,
Yes.
the newest one.
Well, we always had travelled, of course, we had 3rd class, but the Accra, we travelled 1st class.
Right. So I think we were all first. But
Yes.
it was good, and it was nice to be reminded of it.
Yes, I did indeed go on the Oriole.
Anyone
Then, of
else?
course, we went to Kenya, of course, after that.
Yes, Angela.
Rosemary, I'm interested, when you've been with prisoners in the prison, were you allowed to actually pray with them? In fact, did they want you to? Were you allowed to if they wanted you to?
You were strictly forbidden to talk about religion.
Yeah.
You could only do it if they wanted you to.
Yeah. And then were you allowed to if they asked for?
If they asked you to.
Yeah.
But you were, one of the rules was that you never, ever talk religion to them. You offered yourself, not your religion, because a lot of them were Muslims.
Yeah.
Or atheists or whatever. So you were absolutely forbidden. If you'd done that, you wouldn't have been allowed to do the job.
Yeah. But just being who you were made the difference, didn't it?
Being who you were. And of course, we did have services on Sunday where you were allowed to preach the gospel because they'd come to a service.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
The service was rather fun because you got clapped for doing a sermon. they all burst into applause.
Can I just say something to Rose?
Yes.
I don't want to ask a question, Rosemary, but I've just moved back to Dereham, where I used to live, and I spent 2 years at Thorpe Marriott, and I left about 7 weeks ago.
Oh, it's lovely, isn't it?
It's beautiful. I had a big decision whether I should leave or not, but I'm now in Quebec Hall. Yeah, I'm in a bungalow at Quebec Hall in Dereham, which is lovely.
Yes, that's nice.
Yeah.
Well, I was very happy at Thorpe Marriott, and I was the
Lovely
first
church.
minister. It is lovely.
Yes, I can remember that. It's lovely.
I'm going in a week, well, in August, I think, to preach.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you.
It's lovely.
Anybody else?
I probably flattened them all,
No.
or them all stiff. Yes.
No,
Well,
it's
I
lovely.
think you must be exhausted.
Well, I've lived a long time, you see, so it's a lot of life.
Could I just ask, Rosemary, could I just ask a question? I rarely envy your, well, shouldn't envy, should you? But I envy the time that you spent in the prison. Have you written about it?
Not really, no.
Or are you likely to? Because I would love, for one, I'd love to read all your stories, for want of a better way of putting it.
Well, some people disapprove of the way I did it.
That's all right.
But you did it in God's way.
Yeah.
You did it God's way. Not
I did
what
the
can
way
be
I
wrong
thought I was
with
being
God's
called
way.
to do it. Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic.
It was the
Malcolm wants
15
you to have written your whole life.
Oh yes, it was 15 years. That I think 15 of the most perhaps useful years I think I've spent, because it was useful, and I think it made a difference to people to have someone to accept them, because they're rejected. You see, they're despised and rejected, and it seems to me that that's what they need, the gospel more than anything else. Not in words, but in actions, in someone accepting them for what they are, not judgmentally. And that's what I tried to do.
Amen. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Or are we going to finish just on time?
Thank you, Pippa, dear. You're very sweet.
Could I ask
You're
Rosemary?
a very old friend. Sorry.
Yes, somebody's asking.
Heather,
Oh, right.
Heather.
Oh, I can't see you.
Hello, Heather.
can you not?
No,
Oh, there we
because
are.
I've only got
I can
12 on
see
my
Heather.
screen. Oh, no,
All
I've
right.
done something silly.
Rosemary can see you. Hello,
Yeah, go on.
Rosemary.
Hello, Heather.
I just want to say, this isn't a question. This is just to make a statement that we've always liked you, but no, I really we very much admire you. You've led such a long and interesting and fulfilling life, and you talked about the people that had influenced you. I'm sure that you have influenced an awful lot of people. So well done for a life well led.
Thank you, Heather.
Christ-led, spirit-led.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary, for everything.
Thank you. I do say to God quite a lot now, I'm actually tired.
Yeah, not surprised. I am not surprised. It's about time you retired.
Again.
Yes.
So as we finish, Rosemary, would you like to say a prayer for us?
Gracious one, thank you that you have made us your family, your sons and daughters, to carry on the work of your kingdom. Give us the insight, the courage, and most of all, our willingness to have an ever deeper relationship with you, that when we are called, in whatever situation we find ourselves, we are ready to bear witness to your love. Not necessarily in words, but in our actions and the way we are. And the blessing of the God of love, who made us for loving, the blessing of the Son, who bore the cost of loving, and the blessing of the Spirit, who enables us to love and be loved, be with us always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you very much, Glyn, for hosting it.
Thank you, Glenn.
And yes,
You're very, very welcome. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating.
You're a hero, Glenn.
yes.
Thank you, Rosemary.
So
Thank you.
there's no meeting next Tuesday, but bring your glad rags and balloons and whatever the following week for a bit of a party. Okay,
Yeah.
is that everything? Have I said it all?
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you.
Thank you,
Pippa.
Rosemary, very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Glenn.
you, Rosemary.
See
You're
you around.
wonderful.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wonderful.